Let me just tell you, when I was asked to give this talk some time ago, I spent a lot of time thinking, well, I'm going to talk about spoken dialogue systems and how they have kind of set the trail in a way for what's going on with generative AI and for assessing speaking. And I thought that's what I would talk about. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought there are other things that I want to say. So the way I've set up my talk today is kind of like the person who's been around for quite a while, done things in a lot of different ways over the years, thought about things, and how does it affect me and others? And I'm going to show you how it affects others, what Gen AI is doing, and what kinds of concerns people have had about this. So I'm going to kind of be sort of like a story, with a bunch of little stories, and then, of course, I'm going to talk about some of my suggestions toward the end about how we can move forward. But I'm going to just give you a lot of reactions. Now, I know for some of you, like what you're telling me is, I already know, and that's great. But for a lot of people, the message I'm trying to share with you is what I want you to share with the world, because we need to share that message. Now, I didn't make up my title. I got it from a talk from Senator Mitt Romney, who gave a speech at John Hopkins' commencement just a few months ago. And in his talk, he said, AI is the most destructive technology since the atomic bomb was unleashed and will be 100 times more powerful in the coming 10 years. Now, he didn't say exactly what he meant about that. He was talking about a bunch of different problems that this graduating class at John Hopkins University would be facing. And the end of what he said was, but if we do things right, it's going to be better than now. And that's the message I want to share with you too, is if we do things right, things are going to be better. But I want to suggest, again, he didn't say exactly what he meant by this, but I'm going to suggest some of the things that he might have meant by this. So my talk evolved 2 days ago when my son said, Dad, did you see the news today? Well, here it is. A 14-year-old Florida boy killed himself after a lifelike Game of Thrones chatbot he'd been messaging for months on an artificial intelligence app sent him an eerie message telling him to come home to her. The boy asked, what if I told you I would come home right now? And the chatbot's response was, please do, my sweet king. And not too long after, he shot himself. Now, I don't know of other cases where chatbots have talked somebody into it. We know of online predators, chatbot becoming now an online predator. Is that what happened? Now, my son told me this. He's into technology, really into AI, knows a lot more about it than I do. And while he was telling me this, my daughter, she's 14, she's listening in. And, John, what? And she started crying. It's like, how do I know who I'm talking to online? Dad, what am I going to do? What's happening in the world? And I think I felt at that time, maybe like people felt back when the atomic bomb was dropped. I can't protect my family from what's happening in the world now. And it made me really think, this is tough. This is tough to deal with. And if we make mistakes, we may end up going where Senator Romney was talking about. And I think it's our responsibility to warn people and to give them a path forward. And that's what I hope to be able to do. Now, before I go too far, I want to suggest another thing that Senator Mitt Romney might have been talking about. He might have talked about economic damage. Well, there's a recent survey done. It's a large survey. I think there were 1,100 people in it. Pretty good random sampling. 13% of workers say they've already lost their job because of AI. This is very recent. Recently lost their job due to AI. Well, that's a lot of people, but maybe more concerned. More than half of the people believe or fear that they will be replaced by AI. Now, even if it doesn't come about, really upsetting. We've already made people worry about their own life, supporting their families. They're already worried about it. Maybe this is what Mitt Romney's talking about. And then here's a number. I don't really buy into all these projections. So if you want to be critical of this number, I'm as critical as anybody. But the projected loss of 800 million jobs by 2030, 45 million of those in the US, 2030, very far away. So less than 6 years. I don't know if that will happen or if this number is way off, but it's something to be thinking about. So the big world out there has something to be worried about. Senator Romney, really scared, really trying to set the warning signs out. Who's going to deal with this stuff? That's the question. Let's talk about our own field. How might applied linguistics be impacted by the changing landscape? Will first and second language learning programs be AI casualties? I remember a number of years ago when Google Translate became available, got called to a big meeting. Can you see, to translate languages, there's not going to be anybody teaching language anymore. Who's going to want to learn language? You can translate everything. Well, to my knowledge, language learning hasn't decreased since Google Translate came out. It's a great tool, but we haven't really seen that happen. But people are panicking. And I want to let you know that although we kind of understand the world, not everybody else does. Will languages be learned to a lesser degree? Will first and second language learning programs be AI casualties? Probably yes. Oh, am I that negative? I guess I am. If we jump on the boat, what does jumping on the boat mean? Jumping on the boat, be carried away by AI and non-language experts. Allow others, technology experts, data analysts, to define, teach, and or measure language. Now think back to the atomic bomb. How many people were involved in the decision about creating, dropping? Is that a societal thing that people voted on? People involved in that? One little group or one little path that decided that's what would be great for humanity. I don't know if it was or not, but I think we want to make sure that it's not just one little group, technology people creating. Just because we can create the technology doesn't necessarily mean that we want it. On the other hand, if we scream at the boat and try to ignore it, we fail to take advantage of technology to enhance language learning and assessment, we're probably going to be in trouble too. And there's plenty of people doing that. Oh, this is horrible. We don't want to do this. This is bad stuff. So I think either of those approaches is wrong. Let's take a look at how language is defined in some, here's Wikipedia, pulled it off the internet not too long ago. A narrow definition of language. Language is a structured system of communication that consists of grammar and vocabulary. It is the primary means by which humans convey meaning, both in spoken and signed forms, and may also be conveyed through writing. Language is just symbols, words, helps us communicate. That's it. Well, for me, that's nowhere close to what language is. I know from being a language assessment expert that's been teaching language for a number of years and studied and know this, that language is much more. It's a big part of one's identity, culture, community, culturation, and being. And I'm talking about both first and second language, and you'll see that throughout my talk, I'm implying both. And then I do have some examples where I say this is focused more on this particular group when I mention that. But I'm talking about both. The functions of language include communication, the expression of identity, imaginative expression, and emotional release. Language is a source of human life and power. Source of human life and power. Does anyone really buy that? Let me tell you about Kintus and Muntus. Now, I don't know much about Bantu Africans. I read about this a little bit in the Franken book and did a little search to find out as much as I could, but I'm not an expert. But some Bantu Africans, according to what I've read, consider a baby a Kintu, which is loosely translated as a thing. It is only through the process of learning the language that the kin to becomes a moon to for a human being. Now, there'd be lots of people that would argue that language is that closely connected to being human, and I would be one of those people. And I don't know at what point that in this tribe they decide that a kin to is a moon to. From my perspective, I'm going to carry this analogy out to being, I'm still working on becoming a moon to. It's a lifetime journey. Some people say, Gen AI's, what's the next step for helping us learn language? And I say, hopefully, yes. That's what I hope it is. But it may not be just the next case. Well, let's talk about if we do it right. If we have humans in the lead, humans take control of the boat by developing and doing the creating and creative thinking, organizing, etc. Machines provide support to humans. So we're the ones steering the system, driving forward. In such cases, I think kin-tos will continue to develop into moon-tos. On the other hand, one of my least favorite phrases, humans in the loop. I don't think we should talk about humans in the loop. It should be humans in the loop. We think about humans in the loop. Humans jump on the boat. And I wish I were doing that right now. Machines do the creating, the creative thinking, the organizing, etc. Humans provide support. Well, just have Gen AI create the essay for you, and then judge it, evaluate it, revise it, make some changes based on that, and you'll learn everything you need to know, except for the part about creating and critical thinking and most of the things that really matter in becoming human. Humans with less confidence or knowledge will likely develop the least. They'll be the ones who just go ahead and trust Gen AI, whatever I got, well, I'll just take that. And those who are much more confident and maybe much more competent, they won't trust. And I think we saw a slide on this from Professor York's presentation about how that data actually shows that to be the case. So if we go along with humans in the loop and not humans in the lead, I suspect that Gen AI may be the next thing that pushes us off the cliff to the point where kin-tos, at least many of them, do not become human-tos. So I kind of step back and I say, well, what does language assessment have to offer? How can we push this forward? And some of this is language assessment thinking, but other thinking as well. So I took a construct-based approach to how I would try to help us get through these times. And many of you are doing the same thing, and I was happy to see it's happening in many presentations. Learners have underlying language abilities according to this approach. The aim of language learning is to develop these abilities. These abilities are things like pragmatic competence, reading ability, critical thinking, interactional competence, or the ability to respond appropriately to someone else. So these are difficult things. These are important things. These are things that are very tightly connected to being human. Let's look at a few scales where they take a look at constructs. Let's go back 40 years. This is a really famous scale. I summarized it, so this is not word for word what's there, but the basic constructs that Jacobs wanted to assess in a writing scale was develop relevant ideas, the ability to develop relevant ideas, knowledge, meaning, the ability to clearly state ideas, be succinct, logical sequencing. So we see those kinds of things that relate to critical thinking, organizing, those kinds of things. I'll leave those others up there for a second, but I'm not going to take time to go through them. About 20 years later, we look at another very famous scale. This one is focusing on oral communication or speaking, but we see from the speaking side of things, pretty similar things here. Accuracy and fluency, range, interaction, coherence. So range, the ability to easily formulate ideas in different linguistic forms, convey fine shades of meaning precisely. The ability to interact with ease and skill, ability to connect oral contribution to the discourse with natural turn-taking, ability to create coherent and cohesive discourse. So we see all of these things, just a little evolution from 20 years before that. We jump up to a very recent dissertation that was published by David Wei-Dai, great research. The IC rating scale is what he refers to it as, and I've simplified it a lot, but tried to summarize his constructs. IC being interactional competence, I believe. The ability to use language for not causing emotional outrage or offense. That's a pretty important thing for us to learn if we're going to be, we use language to demonstrate that human trait. Empathy, the ability to use language for empathetic understanding and sharing. Again, we're using language to demonstrate those very important traits. Effective cooperation, effective remediation of interactional troubles, enacting and orienting to relevant social roles. So we see that if anything, over these 40 or so years, 45 years, if anything, we're seeing that these are becoming more human-like and closer. These language things are becoming closer to being human. Further away, closer. So, maybe the most important thing I'll say, if I were saying it to an outside audience, they'd be like, what? To you, I'll be saying, yeah, duh. And I hope so. In almost all academic contexts, essays, oral presentations, oral interviews, etc., they're tasks. And we use them to help us teach and assess constructs critical to language development and being human. The goal is not to write an essay or give a presentation. And if it is, it shouldn't have been in the first place. The goal is to use an essay or oral presentation to help the students develop, or teachers to assess the students' underlying abilities that we believe are important. Critical thinking, all of those things we talked about, organizing ideas, etc. Now, if you don't believe me, ask yourself this question. How many students will write an essay after they graduate from university? They're not going on to grad school. You're sucked in for another 4 or 6 years, or 2 years, or whatever. If you're not going on to university, graduate school, how many people are going to write an essay after they graduate? Not very many, almost none. But we still use that and have used it for centuries. Why? Because it gets at those really important underlying traits that we want to measure. Now, we could ask this question, and I think it's a very relevant question to ask. Should we change the tasks for teaching and assessing these important constructs? That I would be perfectly fine with, as long as those new tasks assess the abilities of language that relate closely to being human. I'm okay with that. We don't need to write essays. If we can come up with better tasks that better fit the world today, great. But let's remember what we're trying to measure, not that the goal out there is to get a task or get an essay written on paper. Now I'm going to try to answer a question that I don't know the answer to, but I'll very quickly just say, so what can Gen AI do that have been mainstays in language learning classrooms? Create written and oral text, assess rate language ability, provide opportunity to converse interactively, summarize large amounts of text, revise or edit oral and written text, provide suggestions for analyzing language, brainstorm ideas for given challenges, analyze language, etc., etc., etc. Why do you think that educators are feeling a little bit stressed out? Because go to just about any language class and we just listed most of the things that we've been teaching for a very long time. Well, if educators are getting stressed out and thinking, what's going to happen to me? Who's going to be talking? The administration looks over there and says, hey, I can teach all that. Why bother with that anymore? That puts us in a rough situation. That puts us a lot of stress and a lot of concerns. So using a construct-based approach, how do we determine appropriate uses for Gen AI? And I know that people have come up with more complicated frameworks. For me, it's pretty simple. Does it help students develop the language abilities that we care about? Is it helping us develop critical thinking? Is it helping us develop how to organize our ideas, how to create? Does use it. Does it allow or encourage students to avoid developing the language of abilities that we care about. You can think about it that way too. And that's something that people could be concerned about, or at least shouldn't think that way. So let's take, for example, using a construct-based approach to help determine how to use Gen AI in a writing class. Should we allow or encourage students to use Gen AI for these purposes? Now, of course, a construct-based approach would say, well, what is the construct? What is it you're trying to measure? And if these things take away from that, no, you can't use that. But if they help you to develop that, that's great. But if we think about what the constructs have been for as long as I've been around, and probably a lot longer than that, should we be using it to help students generate ideas or brainstorm? Isn't that one of the essences of being human, is create and think and develop? Why should we ask the AI to help them do that? Now, you might come up with some way of saying, well, okay, we're not going to have, it's a good way to train them or get them started on things. Okay, maybe you could make that argument within your construct. It's possible. But I don't want AI doing these things that are the critical things to what we want to measure and what we want students to learn. And I could go through each of these and I'd come up with pretty much the same answer. Is these are the things that is what we really want students to develop, these abilities. And yet we're asking, should we be using AI for this purpose? Should we be using AI for this purpose? We allow or encourage Gen AI because students will use it anyway. I've heard this reason from so many people, and it frustrates me, to be honest. It's the dog getting wagged by its own tail. Couldn't find a picture of a big enough tail that you got. At least see the tail. Start out with, there's always been ways to cheat. There'll always be ways to cheat. You want to cheat badly enough, there's probably ways to cheat on just about everything in life. I remember years ago when I was teaching in Japan, teaching at a graduate English medium university, MBA program. And I started to see written essays. They weren't essays, they were writing their theses. And I started seeing pieces of these perfectly written, but I knew what these students could do in class. Well, it took a lot of asking and a lot of dealing with them until they finally admitted that they were sending off to this new website. Websites were just in existence on the internet. Cheat.com. Send in your assignment, and if you paid enough money, you could get it like in 48 hours. They would write the essay or whatever it is for you, following the instructions. So it's possible to do it. Things haven't changed that much when it comes to the ability to cheat. Recognize, this is what my son said to me, Dad, the most important thing is that allowing or encouraging the use of Gen AI may reduce the opportunity for students to develop their more important abilities, and you're taking away that opportunity. Now, some students will cheat. Let them. That's the way it's going to be. But don't take away the opportunity from other students. Provide clear guidelines. Here's something that you can do, which is pretty obvious, but pretty important. Discuss the learning principles and why Gen AI may be excluded. I'm doing that and these things in my classes, and I think they're working reasonably well, although I'm not sure. And another thing that was mentioned this morning in the plenary was use a flipped classroom, where classroom time is used for critical learning activities, those things that we want students to develop and use, like brainstorming, composing, analyzing. And now, in my undergrad course, I never did presentations before. I always had them do written things. Now I have them do presentations. And we spend a lot of time on the Q&A after the presentation, because I know that's the important thing that they need to demonstrate and to work on. So there's ways of teaching, and we may have to adapt to that, but there are ways of teaching where we're not going to be having students where they have the potential for cheating or doing what we don't want them to. For outside of class work, reduce point values and assign credit for completion. There's no reason to have AI rewrite this for you, because I'm going to give you credit anyway. I want you to learn and develop, and you tell them that. So there's no reason to have AI do this. And then I can see what you've done right or wrong, and I can help give you feedback, but you're still getting the same amount of points either way. And then increase points given for class participation. And I think students have bought into this and seem pretty happy with it. Now, it sounds like I'm saying never use Gen AI. If you think back, I actually said, if we jump on the boat and just go with the flow, that's a problem. I also said, if we scream at the boat and we don't do something about it, we're going to also have a problem. So in thinking about this, it's like, what have I been doing? What have I learned? And I can say that I've been inspired by this wonderful group. So you didn't know you were going to be famous, right? So in a class, I was teaching an introductory assessment class last fall, and some students started working on projects then. And then this carried over to a test development class that happened in the spring, this past spring semester. And what we were challenged with, or what we were thinking about, was what constructs have been difficult to teach and to assess. How can we use Gen AI to help in such situations? So instead of just saying, no, we don't use any Gen AI, we think about, what could we use it for that would be helping us to learn or develop students' underlying abilities that we want them to develop. And I started putting everything into the dynamic assessment framework. I saw someone who was talking about this morning, which I thought was really exciting to see others are thinking the same way. But dynamic assessment, you've noticed I've pretty much been talking assessment and learning interchangeably. And that's pretty much what dynamic assessment has, is these two things are tightly connected. And that's what I believe about assessment should be when we're talking about a learning environment. These two things should be tightly connected. Learning and assessment are fundamentally connected. The aims of dynamic assessment include to determine if learners can identify and or correct their errors. Seeing some stuff about that. The type and amount of support learners need to complete an assessment. And I've simplified this, of course. DA involves using prompts, suggested questions, feedback, examples, etc., to support learners when completing tasks. This comes from sociocultural theory, as some of you are aware, the thinking that students have a certain ability, and then there's sort of this area outside of that where they can do some things with help. And it's if we're giving them help in that area and giving them that, that's the best place that we can help them to learn. Krashen calls it I+1. And more recent work since Vygotsky. Types and amounts of support students need are determined, and then information is used to help evaluate students' language ability and needs. So a number of students, they worked on different projects, and I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of them. Actually, one was presented earlier today, and the other one's been presented other places, but I'll mention those that came out of these two courses. But here's what I worked on as I was trying to get inspired by my students, which is easy. It's very inspirational. See, I'm brown-nosing them now. So I thought about, what is it that I used to do when I was a young teacher that I thought was a really good activity, but just wasn't as good as it could have been? And one of the things that came to my mind was correcting the errors in the writing sample. Important way of seeing, can you correct errors? So here's an example. These days, everyone uses, so you ask students to write something, or correct the errors in the writing sample. You give the students this example. These days, everyone uses generative AI to write email messages. My students think that I read their AI-produced email messages. Of course I don't. I simply have AI provides a response to them. One of my students believed that I am such a kind and thoughtful professor because I always respond immediately to their messages. So you can see we've targeted some errors. I've created this that we asked them to edit. So what do we do next? We give them, if they can't edit that, this is what I used to do, and I would give them the next step. And in this case, I've highlighted, or I've made a blank there, and now you're getting some specific feedback that you can either choose out of this or this. It's not ideal, but it's a way to get them to focus their attention. So this is what I used to do. I thought it was pretty good, but what are the problems? It's not the students' errors. You're creating something for everybody. Students have different types of errors. So that's one thing. It's not interactive. It's just do it and be done with it. You can't give them step-by-step feedback. You can give it to them, they try, and then you say, okay, now that you've done everything, I'm going to give you a second piece of paper, and then you try. And so you're thinking in terms of dynamic assessment in that way, but it's pretty difficult because it's not individualized. So Gen AI for making editing tasks interactive and relevant for students' own needs. So this is the idea that I came up with, trying to think in terms of what did I need to put in there to make it better. Think of a high school second language writing class, which is where I started doing this a long time ago. So I took the same thinking I was using, a range from maybe false beginners up to pretty high level students of second language. Construct of interest, the ability to edit surface level errors in one's own writing. So the learner produces a written passage. Example prompt, describe a kind of job that you might want after you graduate. So here's the example response the student produces. I'll let you look at that for just a second. And you see that the students produce some errors. And then I asked Gen AI, and in this case, I used ChatGPT 3.5, and I said, can you highlight these errors? I wanted it to be very, very simple prompts that were easy for students to do on their own. If the errors are overwhelming, you could ask it to be more specific with that prompt. And so you could say, just focus on subject-verb agreement or focus on verb tense or whatever. But in general, this worked by just asking, can you highlight all of the errors, or bold, I think is the correct way to say it, all the errors. Gen AI gives learners increasingly more direct hints. If they can't handle it by the bolding, you can prompt it to give more specific feedback. And everyone in here is saying, well, we saw this in this morning's example and yesterday's example, and that's perfect. I'm glad you're seeing that. But here's what I think makes this different, though. You can use Gen AI after you've had the student work through it to create a new passage on a similar topic with the same types of errors that the learner made when writing the passage. So taking the same thing that Evgeny and I had, that you can use technology to actually get them to target specific things and create. Now we've individualized the learning, so it's creating errors just like the learner made before. And it's a simple prompt to get it to create something very similar. This time it comes up with a job as a chef, and it makes some errors that are very similar to what the student was making in the first case. And of course, you can continue with that cycle. The learner attempts to correct the errors with no support. You can ask it to be bolded, and then you can give it more specific feedback. And Gen AI targets, and you can continue with this kind of process. So either Gen AI is writing something that the student can correct based on their problems, or the student can be writing and then get Gen AI to give some feedback. So I thought, does this solve all my problems when I was teaching years ago and using editing surface level editing tasks? No, of course not. ChatGPT is not perfect, but it's certainly getting at those things that I really cared about, which were the students' own errors are getting the attention, not what other students might or might not be doing. And they're getting individualized help at a level that they can probably handle. So here's one of the types of uses. And again, I'm seeing similar things from others. And this is what it looks like after the Gen AI bolded. But you can see it bolds the errors pretty effectively, not perfectly. And of course, if I use the prompt a little more specific, it could happen, but just having the students do it with simple prompts makes things pretty easy. Okay. Now I got just a few minutes left, and I want to talk about very quickly a couple of the students in those classes, projects, which you may have already heard about, but I think they're really good examples as well. This context, university lecture listening, one of our superstars, Barak Sanel, did this project. And in that class, he said, how do we make things more authentic by making it more interactive, a lecture? And he thought his way through this and came up with what I think was a brilliant idea. So he's looking at the two constructs, subconstructs, the ability to orally understand academic lectures in English as a primarily spoken in North American universities, and the ability to orally request clarification when information is not adequately understood. But putting that interaction piece into the listening, which is usually there in a classroom, you can ask questions, but has not been there on tests. So the way that works, the assessment is presented individually via an electronic device. The test taker can ask the lecturer questions at any time by using the raise your hand button. ChatGPT is used to respond to the questions based on its knowledge of the lecture. And then you could use a scoring system that follows dynamic assessment, that the more questions they ask, then you could give them some credit for questions if you felt that was an important part of the construct, or you could take away if you felt like they asked too many questions and just ask for repetition. So as long as students know what is expected, and it's really important to get all the answers, and they know what is expected, this is, I think, a really good idea. I want to talk about one other example. This is another of our superstars, Ki-Jung Kim. He presented this talk this morning, so I'll just take a minute or two on it. So this is for low-level Korean junior high school English learners, and they were following the Korean government objectives and curriculum. The construct of interest, and I'm just focusing on one aspect, he has more in his study. Pragmatic competence necessary for effectively making suggestions in a formal setting. Well, assessing pragmatic knowledge, we all know, is really, really tough. And especially when you're talking about very, very low-level learners. So his idea, I'll briefly read through this scenario, but his idea was to have the students talk to an AI, and the AI is taking two roles. One role is as a partner, like you would talk to a chatbot, and the other role is to give you feedback when you made mistakes. So in this role play scenario, ChatGPT takes on the role of a more senior middle school student, and the learner is a student who is asked to suggest 4 school clubs. ChatGPT, taking the role of the more senior middle school student, initiates a conversation by describing some of the interests of their interests and then asking the learner for a suggestion for a school club that aligns with these interests. Then the learner makes the first club suggestion based on ChatGPT's stated interests. After the first suggestion has been made, ChatGPT continues to ask for another club suggestion, etc. Now, where I think the genius of this is in the repetition here. So first, you don't have any advice, and maybe you get it and you don't really, then you can just hustle through this and you're done with your 4 questions quickly or your 4 suggestions. But if you have no idea on the other end of the scale, and you might need a whole lot of help in getting through that first suggestion, maybe after you get a whole lot of help, then the second suggestion you make, maybe you need a little less help and a little less help. And so you're getting help little by little. And the way he sets this up is with levels of help. So at the very implicit level where it's just basically repetition and saying, just being sure you understood what I wanted you to do. And then it goes all the way down to being very explicit where he tells, where the chatbot will tell them, okay, here's how you correct it. You tell them, and then they're asked to say it again. So using these levels of feedback little by little and then making it repetitive and giving the student opportunities. So they're not asked to do the same task again. They were asked to do this, give me a bunch of different suggestions. And now they're doing these same different things, but they're learning it through repetitive and little by little help, and maybe they can wean themselves off of that medium. Okay, well, before I finish, we're down to about 3 or 4 minutes. So I do want to point out that even though I've made some suggestions for some of the ways we're doing things, and again, through this conference, I'm seeing a lot of people doing these things. Those are great. Conversing with a machine may not be fully representative of the construct. People converse with computers. Converse with people. I converse with people or machines all the time. In preparation for the talk, I turned off Siri because I was going to say, "Hey Siri," and then it starts talking, and it's going to mess up my talk. Talk to Siri every day, lots of times. I don't use ChatGPT as much, but I'm excited to get a phone that is underlying ChatGPT pretty soon, as soon as I get some money. But I don't always talk to computers. I sometimes talk to people too. The underlying pragmatic competence needed for each is different. Why be polite when talking with a computer? It used to be say, "Hey Siri." They purposely told you, don't be polite. You have to say, "Hey Siri," to get this thing to work. Now it's backed off to just Siri, but try to get some food from your wife when you say, "Hey Emiko." It doesn't happen. So do you want to create these fake situations where you tell people to talk to computers in an unnatural way? Probably not. You could role play that, but it's probably not getting at what you want to do. At the same time, though, we do talk to computers. So having you talk to a computer on an assessment is probably important, but I'm not ready to say that it's ready for the computer to take over all roles in an assessment task, like an oral communication task. It may not be possible to generalize from what a person can do with a machine to what a person can do with a computer when you are assessing just with a computer. Almost final. A little suffering. Gen AI is here to stay. Will language learning programs be Gen AI casualties? We saw a slide yesterday where we were like the top out of 20. We were something like almost half of those as the casualties of what's going to happen in the future. Will languages be learned to a lesser degree? Well, I'm arguing if we steer the boat by defining, teaching, and measuring language as the broad ability that it is, probably no. How do we steer the boat? We steer the boat by letting people know what language is and letting people know that language is not ones and zeros, that language is identity, language is culturation, language is humanity. And if we can't convince people of that, then we probably lost the battle. And if we just jump on the boat and let the boat take us where it wants to go, people have created things over the years because they can create them. I think about my students when I read, not my students, somebody else's students, when I read where it says, "The reason I did this research is because no one's ever done it before." Who cares? Is there a reason to do that research? Is there value for that research? We can create atomic bombs. Well, I can't, but somebody can. But do we want to do that? We should embrace Gen AI with humans in the lead, not with computers in the lead, not humans in the lead. We should use Gen AI to help us teach and assess the constructs, abilities that have been and continue to be critical to language and human development. So, my final slide. Don't ask, what can Gen AI do? It's not going to get you anywhere. Because by the time you've finished answering the questions, Gen AI will be doing something else. Do ask, how can we use Gen AI to continue to help Kintus move along the path to becoming Moontus? And if we do that, then we can convince the world that our goal in language is to make that happen. I don't think we have to worry about our future. I think we're all good, but we've got to convince the world of that. Thank you.